Most people are training in this garbage zone.
What garbage zone is Peter talking about in this video, and is this really the best training advice for everybody? In this video, I'm going to break down Peter Attia's advice on zone 2 training and high intensity training and go a little bit deeper to see when this advice actually makes sense and when it might be counterproductive for your training and your progress. But first of all, let's watch Peter's clip together.
Most people are training in this garbage zone where it's too high in intensity to build a true aerobic foundation and too low in intensity to truly stress the body glycolytically. So zone 2 is that all-day pace. Lactate has to be below 2 millimolar. You have to be, this is a pace you should be able to hold all day. And that's easier than, people are used to training. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's gotta be this real push pace, kind of your 4x4 pace, right? 4 on, all out, 4 off. And most people aren't used to that level of discomfort. So they're suffering two problems. One, they're in a physiologic no man's land, and two, there's no variability to it anyway. Even though you say it's obvious, I think it's important for people to hear this discussion because I don't think enough people understand, both for performance and also longevity, why you have to be at the more extremes of kind of zone 2, zone 5 is where the progress comes.
Before I go into any details, I want to say that I absolutely love Peter's work. I highly recommend that you check out his podcast called The Drive Podcast. And this is absolutely not a personal dig at Peter. And this is really just discussing ideas and trying to grow as a community and help everybody improve their performance and their understanding of exercise and exercise physiology. So if I had to sum everything that Peter said in that video up in one clear sentence, he's essentially saying that people need to stop training in the middle and get out to a more polarized approach to training with some low and some high intensity to get the best progress, both in performance and in longevity. So first of all, let's look at what the garbage zone is and where it falls on the intensity spectrum. So here's a simple illustration of the intensity spectrum. You have low, medium, high, and very high intensity. If you want to talk in physiological terms, those are the moderate, the heavy, the severe, and the extreme domain. To break apart the low and the medium intensity, we have what's called the first threshold, whether it's a lactate threshold or a ventilatory threshold. To break apart the medium and the high intensity, we have the second threshold, which could be, again, a lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold. Some use critical power, some use MLSS. There's many different terms, but what Peter talks about here when he talks about the garbage zone is really the medium intensity. And if we push beyond just the physiology and we start talking about training zones, here we can see how the typical 5-zone or 5+ zone model is essentially superimposed on those physiological domains. We have zone 1 and 2 that are in the low intensity domain. We have zone 3 and 4, which are in that medium intensity or heavy domain, with zone 4 typically being kind of straddling the medium and the high intensity. We have zone 5, which is high intensity or the severe domain. And then beyond that, it really depends on what sport you practice. Some have a couple extra zones. I like to use 7. But if you practice a sport that requires a lot of high intensity work, thinking about, for example, 500 meters sprinting on the rower, you might actually break up that very high intensity into 3, 4 or more zones so that you can kind of break apart the different types of training. So it's important to understand that zones are not physiological. Zones are it's just a model that we superimpose on the physiology so that we can make our life a little bit easier in terms of planning. And so when Peter talks about the garbage zone, he's talking about that medium intensity or that zone 3, zone 4. And so when does this advice actually hold water? When should somebody avoid the middle and train at low and at high intensity? And I think it's applicable to some people, but not necessarily everybody. And to give you an example of this, let's take an athlete that I worked with in the past. His name is Nicolas Rolla. More specifically, he was a junior world champion in the optimists sailing category. He later moved on to the laser category. And that's the time frame where I worked with him in strength and conditioning for about 2-3 years before he got recruited by the Alinghi Swiss sailing team, and he's been with them now now for a few years. And I was lucky enough to train Nico for, like I said, 2-3 years, all the way up to him getting selected by the Alinghi Red Bull Racing team. And in that time, because of the demands of the laser sailing category, he did a lot of strength training, but he also did a lot of cycling because of the endurance that you need in the quads to maintain that awkward position on the boat. And for quite a long time, actually, during our collaboration with Nico, he kept the reins on the cycling training because he enjoyed it, because he thought he managed it well. And I was in charge of the strength training and the more specific rappel training position for the boat. And typically, Nico would do a lot of longer, harder rides, either outside where he liked to push himself like every cyclist, or he would do some really hard Zwift sessions on his home trainer at home. And so essentially he ended up training a lot in that zone 3, zone 4 kind of area, exactly that garbage zone that Peter talks about in this clip. And so again, he saw really good progress, right? He had some really solid numbers on the bike. But I remember that about 4 months before he had to go and pass the selection test for the Alinghi Red Bull Racing team, he said, "Hey, Sean, I'd like you to take over my cycling training because I've been managing it up until now. It's been working well, but I'd like something different and something structured by you so that we can just get ready for those tests." So we looked at the demands of the test that he was going to have to prepare for. And one of the tests was going to be a maximal 3-minute all-out test. So for those who don't know it, it's probably the worst test that exists in exercise in general. It's essentially an all-out effort for 3 minutes straight. So you sit on the bike and you start pedaling like a madman and you never stop until you hit the 3-minute mark. And one upside of this test, outside of it being absolutely terrible and mentally really hard, one upside is that it's 1 3-minute test, and you can technically extrapolate critical power and W prime from this test, because the critical power is essentially what you have left in the last 30 seconds of the test, and the W prime is the surface area under the curve, under the power curve, which is technically the amount of work that you could do at high intensity. And they also had a progressive step test to measure VO2 and measure thresholds on the bike. And given what he had been doing in his training, which again was some fairly long rides with quite a bit of intensity sustained throughout, and typically falling in that kind of medium intensity, and very often doing the same, and not really doing any easy rides, and not really doing any really hard sessions, I decided to switch his training to essentially go into a more polarized distribution versus the more pyramidal distribution that he was using before. And at first, he really wasn't sure about it because it was quite different than what he had done in the past. And that would fall directly in line with Peter's advice, with getting out of the middle and start training more at the extremes, really lowering your low intensity to the point where it feels too easy and you could sustain it for hours, and then really doing some hard sessions. So we did some harder VO2 efforts. We did some microbursts, so some 30-15s. We also did some longer intervals, typically maybe not 4 minutes, but we did some 3 minutes with hard starts. And then we even did some really short, really intense, kind of 1 minute, 1.5 minute efforts with 3-4 minute rest. And I remember Nico messaging me a week out of the tests and saying, "Hey, Sean, are you sure we've done enough? Are you sure we've trained hard enough? Because I don't feel the same as I typically feel on the bike. I don't feel ready." We had done quite a big taper too, which he wasn't necessarily used to. He's young, full of energy, always wanted to train. And I said, "You know what? Go do the test. Let's see how it goes, and we'll reassess afterwards." And lo and behold, he passed the test with flying colors. He had the best numbers he's ever put out on the bike. He, if I'm not mistaken, he was the best sailor in the team in the selection process, because there were people that had sailed before, and then there was people that were going for the power group that were just monsters. Shout out to Barnaby for those who know this absolute unit in the rowing. He used to be in the rowing team in Switzerland. I think he pulled a 540 2K on the erg, for those that have that reference. And anyway, he's part of the power team now. Nico was already a sailor, so he was in the sailing group. And so he passed the test. He did great. And so Peter's advice worked perfectly in that situation, right? Because Nico was doing a lot of middle work, but now we switched to a more polarized approach for a few months, and he had a lot of success with this and some absolutely great results. So if you're in that same situation and you like to ride hard very often, to the point where you don't really do any short, hard efforts, and to the point where you're not doing any low intensity training, then I'd say Peter's advice is a good advice, and you should switch up your training and go to a more polarized distribution. And for those who aren't sure what I'm talking about when I'm saying polarized pyramidal, let's have a look at the different intensity distributions that exist and that you can use to structure your training. So when we talk about intensity distribution, typically it refers to how the low, medium, and high intensity are distributed in the training plan. So if we take a low intensity training approach, we would have the vast majority of training being done at low intensity and very little medium and high intensity. If we were to take a threshold distribution, it would be mainly that garbage zone or that middle ground, and then very little low intensity and very little high intensity. A fully high intensity training program typically has mostly high intensity. Now, there's other ways to approach it. You could have a uniform distribution where you have kind of a balanced amount of low, medium, high intensity. I think that's great for a beginner, for example. You have a pyramidal approach, which is mostly low intensity with some medium intensity, very little high intensity. And then the polarized distribution, which is a lot of low intensity, a bunch of high intensity, but very little middle or medium intensity. And we could also look at other distributions like a sprint distribution with mainly low intensity and very high intensity. But in this case, what we want to focus on are the two in the gray box here. And typically the one that Peter is talking about is the polarized distribution. And again, if all you've done for months and maybe years is more of a threshold distribution, the one in the top in the middle, well, obviously switching that up and going to a polarized distribution is definitely the right idea. And that's going to be one way of making a lot of improvements. However, we have to remember that training has a cost and different training intensities have different costs. So let's look at a couple other slides to understand what this means to train in a polarized way and why you can't just do it forever. On this graph, we have the intensity at the bottom and we have the cost of training at the top. And typically what we see is that low intensity training has a very low cost, whether it's metabolically, whether it's from a nervous system standpoint. Essentially, it's training that you can do all day and that's not going to cost you much in return, except for the calories you have to eat to compensate for the work that you're doing. Medium intensity has a slightly higher cost to training. But then high intensity has a much higher cost when it comes to the metabolic demands, when it comes to the nervous system demands. And obviously the very high intensity stuff is very, very demanding, especially on the Wingate type intervals. This is typically the training that's going to cost you the most. And that's usually the part that we forget when we talk about high intensity and low intensity and what the studies show in terms of improving VO2max and what's the best for longevity, is that we have to consider how much the training that we do costs so that we can balance things out intelligently. And yes, a polarized approach to training is going to help you if you've only done threshold for a long period of time. But I don't think that that's all you should be doing, because if you just say, okay, I'm just going to do polarized training with low intensity and high intensity for the rest of my life, I really don't think that's the most productive approach to training. Because one, you're not going to progress forever, right? It is going to have the best returns on investment, especially at first, especially in the first 4, 8, 12, maybe 16 weeks. But there comes a point where your body gets used to the work that you're doing. It's called accommodation, and it's part of the adaptation process. So your body's going to adapt. And like Alex Hutchinson said, famously said, the best training is the one you've never done. The best stimulus is the one you've never had. So if you've only done threshold up until now, switch to polarized training, it's going to help you a lot. Why? In part because it's new. Obviously, because it's also potent, but it's mainly new. And so you are going to improve. But you're going to improve for a few months. And beyond that, again, you ideally have to switch again and come back to maybe a more pyramidal distribution so that you can alternate between those two modes. And those are not the only two that you can use. And there's obviously shades of gray between those two. But as a big idea in training, you could say that, okay, I want to focus on polarized training for 8 to 12 weeks. And then I want to go and do a pyramidal phase where I might work there for 3 to 4 months and kind of bounce back and forth between those two, sprinkle in some sprints in there. Maybe at the beginning of the season, you want to do a more kind of a base phase where you do mostly low intensity with a few sprints to keep that top end neuromuscular speed aspect to your training as well. And that's kind of the overview of training. And then if we talk about the adaptations that we see and the potential to improve on different systems and different types of training, I want to go to the next slide. And here we're going to see the developmental potential. And what we could see is that the very high intensity training, so sprint interval training, for example, is really quick to improve, but the overall potential that you could develop over a year, 2 years, 5 years, or a lifetime of training is fairly low. And then if we go to the high intensity, it takes a bit more time to improve. It is going to have more developmental potential than the very high intensity. But again, it's not the most potential that you have. If we look at medium intensity training, it takes much longer to develop, but the ceiling is much, much higher. And finally, the low intensity goes much, much longer in terms of how long it takes to see changes, but how much you can train it and how far you can develop that system and that type of training is potentially infinite. And thanks to Alan Cousins for the inspiration on this graph. And what's interesting is that this graph's been around now for a few years thanks to Alan, but there's a study that came out not so long ago and that showed this exact same thing between endurance training in blue, high intensity training in green, and sprint interval training in orange. And what do we see here? If we compare all the studies that they looked at in this systematic review and meta regression, the references at the bottom here, is that if you compare different modes of training, most notably here, sprint interval training, high intensity training, and endurance training, well, sprint interval training is superior at the 2-week mark because you are going to improve things much faster with this type of training. But again, remember the cost of this training, which also means you cannot just do sprint interval training 3 times a week for the rest of your life. The high intensity training starts a little bit lower, the green curve, but then it keeps improving. It goes way beyond. So once you get to the 4-week mark or beyond, high intensity looks to be superior in the research in the literature. And then if you push that thought process with low intensity training, what do we see? Well, it keeps going even far beyond what we could see with high intensity training. And again, I think that speaks to the cost of those different types of training and their potential for development. And definitely the low intensity is the thing that you'll be able to train the most and for the longest time and still see improvement. And so I think this is a really important graph to understand and to use in your planning because you can't just do a 16-week cycle of sprint interval training. I mean, you could, but how much is it going to cost you from a nervous system standpoint, metabolic standpoint, and are you actually going to keep progressing after 10 weeks? That's a question that remains to be answered. And again, I'm not here to say that sprint interval training is a bad idea. You should definitely use it, but you should know what the cost of using such training is, and you should plan it intelligently in your global endurance training approach. So to come back to Peter's advice on switching to a more polarized distribution of training intensity, I think this is great advice for people who have been kind of running the threshold train forever and need to switch it up. And they need to go to the low intensity and to the high intensity to do something new and to do something that's productive. But again, after 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks of high intensity training, you might want to switch back to something more pyramidal in distribution. So keep the low intensity, keep the the zone 2 training, but also do some medium intensity tempo session, threshold sessions instead of the high intensity, and do that for a while, see how you improve. And I can guarantee that your threshold numbers by that time will be much improved given your polarized cycle and the pyramidal phase that you're doing right then and there. And also to come back on the VO2max prescription or recommendation that Peter gave, he talked about that 4x4 session. So 4 minutes all out, 4 minute off, 4 minute all out. And I think you could probably improve that just a little bit if your goal is to improve your VO2 max by shortening the rest intervals to maybe 2 minutes and increasing the total number of sets from 4 to maybe 5 or 6, all the way up to 8, depending on how much volume and intensity you can tolerate. And also play around with some shorter high intensity type sessions, whether they're Tabata format, whether they're 30-15s, the microbursts. You could go all the way to 40 on, 20 off. You could even go to 1 minute on and 30 seconds off. The idea is just to do hard work and to accumulate a whole bunch of it in a session. And also you maybe shouldn't do all out sessions all the time, right? Even though you're doing high intensity work, high intensity doesn't mean 10 out of 10 in terms of RPE, in terms of how hard it feels. You should definitely be in the 8+ range, and you should definitely go and hit 10 once in a while. I definitely recommend that you do, but it's always good to keep a little bit of a margin because it also gives you an opportunity to build on those sessions and make them progressively either harder or progressively longer over time. Because remember, there's no single session that's going to make you better. It's just the compounding effect of being disciplined and doing those sessions over and over again, week in and week out. That's going to be what will help you to get better. And typically I'd say that most people should do 1 to 2 harder sessions in a week, whether it's high intensity or medium intensity. And the rest of the time they should build some volume at low intensity. Whether it's short or long is really going to depend on how much volume you're doing right now and what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve. But really 1 to 2 harder sessions, whether it's medium or high intensity in the week, the rest low intensity. And again, switch it up once in a while. Don't stay stuck in one way of doing things. And there's even maybe a case where that polarized approach is not the best option. And the one case I'm thinking of off the top of my head is people that are, for example, competing in CrossFit and have been pushing pretty hard on the CrossFit Metcon side for 2-3 years. And I've seen a lot of those people, a lot of them come to talk to me because they want to build their endurance, but doing 5 Metcons a week doesn't help them anymore. Well, guess what? You've been stuck in the high intensity distribution for so long. It's just not enough for you to improve anymore. And you've developed a big engine through all that work, but now the chassis isn't enough to support that engine. So what you need to do is switch it up. And typically for those people that have been doing a lot of high intensity for a long time, switching to a pyramidal approach with mostly low and medium intensity shows a ton of great results. You can really improve. And I've seen some really significant changes, not only in their base endurance over even 12 weeks of training, but the transfer to CrossFit, the transfer to the high intensity activities is actually pretty impressive. And it's pretty cool to see that even training on a bike for 12 weeks will actually help your CrossFit because you will develop that muscular endurance, you will develop that cardiovascular system in a way that you're not used to training. And remember what Alex said, the best training is the one you've never done, the best stimulus is the one you've never had. So here you go for this little breakdown of Peter Attia's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a comment. Let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover in the future. And if I had to sum up this advice is stick to your training for a while, but don't be afraid to change it up every 3 to 4 months so that you could do something new and then keep improving on different ends of your intensity distribution. Remember that low, medium, high, very high intensity. You want to essentially go all over that spectrum throughout the year, and you shouldn't be stuck in one box or the other for more than a few months. Thanks again for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.